We've had an interesting voice leading the discussion about F1's direction and where it's going in the future, but also how we've got to where we are now following so many fan complaints after what was, let's face it, a pretty boring French Grand Prix. To give you a hint, it's this guy, Lewis Hamilton. He was asked all kinds of questions after the race about why it was so boring, as if it's somehow his fault, and he was very quick to point out that it's not his fault, of course. And to talk about what Lewis said, I've got Jack Benyon and Jake Boxall-Legge with me. Jack, it was really interesting listening to what Hamilton had to say after the race. He had a lot to say on the state of F1 and potentially the future of F1. What did he tell us and what did you make of it?
It's an interesting one. There's not many benefits of spending a weekend with F1 reporter Scott Mitchell, but one of the benefits is he was in that press conference, so I got a little bit of an inside scoop after he'd come out of it to hear all about it. And interestingly, the comments that he's made didn't actually come from a direct question. He kind of ran with a bit of a chat that was going on with one of the reporters in the press conference. He wasn't actually asked a direct question about 2021 regulations. So he's clearly very passionate about this because he almost interrupted the next person's question in order to go back and consult this. And basically his points were that it's not the driver's fault after a lot of criticism that they got from the French Grand Prix of how boring it was. Basically blaming the rule situation we've got and the situation that F1 is in more generally in terms of its commercial deals and things like that. So directly pointed to Bernie Ecclestone by name in terms of his role in how the sport's developed. And obviously we've got a situation where some teams are paid a lot more money than other teams. That stunts the growth of the smaller teams and we get this gulf between the teams. It's a well-trodden path that we talked about many, many times. It's unusual for someone like Lewis to come out and really nail down into the specifics of why we're in the situation that we're in right now. So, really good to hear his comments of really getting into this issue and putting himself on the line, his name to these quotes, which doesn't always happen very often with the F1 drivers. So yeah, looking at the rules, he said that the rules are creating this poor racing that we're having at the minute, and that's allied to the fact that we've got a poor commercial situation. And that came after, earlier in the weekend, he talked about the situation with the 2021 rules, where he'd gone to a meeting. He was one of the drivers along with Nico Hülkenberg to discuss where the 2021 regulations were up to and actually criticised those and said they were nowhere near where they needed to be.
And that's the fascinating thing, isn't it? This isn't just some driver who's a good talker further down the grid. This is the guy, this is arguably the most iconic driver of the current era of F1. Being prepared to kind of stick his head above the parapet and say, look, this is what I feel, and showing that he does have such a passion for the sport still, and even about its future, where potentially he might not even be racing in years to come, but he's still worried about what's going to happen to the sport that he loves.
I think these comments prove that he really does have a good hold of where the sport is going, and where the sport is now, and what needs to be done to see it go to a better place in the future. So I think it's just a kind of a really good summary of Lewis Hamilton as a driver, and proof that he's very invested in this sport. He knows a lot about it, and he's not just a person who turns up on a race weekend and is suddenly brilliant at everything and then disappears and doesn't think about F1 ever again.
Now let's look forward with Lewis to the 2021 Regs JBL. We've given you the somewhat taxing task of coming up with your own technical package for 2021, which will release in the F1 summer break in August. That's a big enough challenge for you, just sketching something out and having our animators create it. Can you imagine how difficult it must be for F1 with so many people with vested interest and all these different stakeholders, including now the drivers, coming forward and saying what they want, or at least what they think is wrong with the current package?
Well, the problem is that I can't decide what I want. So when it comes to having various stakeholders in Formula One, you have all of the guys at the top, you have all of these teams, even the drivers as well, all wanting different things. That's just a recipe for disaster, isn't it? So obviously everybody's going to want a much better on-track product. That's basically, I think, the main mandate. That's the main brief. 2021, it's got to look spectacular and it's got to deliver something good on track. But people also want the cars to look futuristic and look in a certain way. 2009, the cars looked a bit off. They had the weird skinny rear wing. They had the snowplow front wing. And people didn't like the way they looked, but they raced quite well. But then you ended up in 2017 and you had spectacular looking cars, and now they don't race very well at all. So Formula One's at a bit of a crossroads. It needs to kind of decide what it wants to be. As I said, for me, it's hard for me to decide what I want it to look like, and I've come up with a few sketches. Can't really decide what I want. People are going to be looking into the minutiae of the car, looking at end plate size and going, oh, we need that to be a bit bigger for sponsor logos. This is going to need to be smaller for X, Y and Z reason. It's a mess. And we're at a point now where the rules aren't going to be set in stone until October at the earliest. And, people are going to be starting to look at designing their cars now. And you just wonder whether this is going to happen at all, quite frankly. We're going to get to 2021 and we're not going to be sure what we're going to see.
So do you think there's a genuine concern there that, and this is, I think, something that's starting to come out now, firstly with the delay, secondly with Hamilton's comments, that we are potentially, having been promised a massive 2021 overhaul of F1, are we now potentially heading to a point where whatever we get is going to be so interfered with that it's just bound to be watered down?
Yeah, it's just going to be compromises all over the board, because you're going to want one group that wants something extreme. You're going to want another group that goes, well, we can't stray too much from Formula One. It has a certain image, it has a certain prestige attached to it, so it needs to remain with that. You're going to have some people that want, I don't know, maybe stick with the halo head protection. Some people are going to want IndyCars doing the aero screen. Maybe we should do that. Some people go, oh, well, then it's too much like IndyCar. You can have arguments everywhere, and we're going to come to a point where the 2021 car is nobody's vision. It's just a mixture of what everybody's asked for. There needs to be a point where somebody steps up, takes ownership and says, look, this is what we're having. We've done the research, we've looked into it. This is what 2021 is going to be. If you don't like it, there's the door.
This is the key issue, because Max Verstappen came out and said that he wanted F1 to have some sort of dictator, and immediately after making those comments everyone kind of went, oh, we don't want to go back to a Bernie situation, we don't want to go back to that. But I don't think he was referring to a dictator in a Bernie sense. I think he was just referring to someone who could make those difficult decisions, because drawing up a set of regulations is a difficult task, but it's not one that is too difficult. Any designer or engineer could probably come up with a good set of regulations for the future F1. The problem is the fundamental question of what is F1. That is the issue that we're facing here, and that's why the 2021 regulations are so difficult, because we're either going to move to more towards an entertainment formula, like many other championships out there. Formula E is geared more towards that, IndyCar's geared more towards that, or we're going for the kind of the old school F1, let the engineers develop, build the fastest car they possibly can, and just let them loose with the regulations. So there has to be some sort of balance, and I really agree with what Max Verstappen said. I really would hate for someone like Bernie to be in charge, where they're giving special deals to certain teams and things like that. That part of being a dictator we wouldn't want, but we do need someone to step up and say, here's what the future of F1 looks like. We want it to be an entertainment formula, or we want it to be for the purist. It really needs that decision to be made.
If you try and prescribe too much what a car is going to look like, that's never like a recipe for anything good. That's, you end up with a spec series essentially. If you try and pen people in more and more and more, you're just going to end up with the same result. And I think you have to open it out a little bit, manage what the inputs are rather than what the output is. So you manage what the teams can do with X amount of resource, so a cost cap or a certain amount of downforce available, that kind of thing. Manage that input and you go, okay, now go away, come up with something that fits that brief and then go and race it. I think that's what you have to do. But at the moment we're just managing that output and it's just not working. I
think we've seen that the managing the output doesn't work, and we constantly get to the same situation where we've got cars that can't race. So if we're trying to manage the output all the time, clearly the people who are doing that are not capable of doing it effectively, and therefore you're right, that needs to be taken away, and it needs to be the input that's controlled and not the output.
Yeah, I think the frustrating thing with the 2017 regulation changes, firstly, it all came about for claims that the cars weren't fast enough in the previous generation of regulations. So it all became make them as quick as possible. But anyone with any modicum of common sense could see that was going to create cars that couldn't race. And here we are, 2 and a bit seasons later, and we're all moaning about the racing not being good enough. Well, we knew that, in 2016 when we saw the regulations. So that's frustrating. But Jack, last point, you mentioned that F1 needs, well, you both mentioned F1 needs someone to stand up and just sort of take control of this situation. Should that person be Ross Brawn? Because Ross has responded to Lewis's comments, welcoming him with open arms to get much more involved in the 2021 discussion. Is that a smart move from Ross to perhaps tell Lewis to put his money, time, effort and presence where his mouth is and say, come on then, yeah, please come and join us, become a part of this, and then you're partly responsible for whatever comes out the other end?
We were talking about this off air earlier, and I think it's dangerous to have drivers having too much effect on the rules in the same way that it is teams. one of the whole reasons we got to this point is we've got too many stakeholders, got too many cooks in the kitchen. We need to remove some of them. So for me, no, it's not a good idea, and I don't think. Well, based on what Ross said, I don't think he's read Lewis's comments completely, because Lewis actually said, it's not my job to decide what the regulations are, it's my job to turn up and drive the car. And I think that's exactly, that's the right thing. I think the drivers should be straw polled about rules, they should be asked about things, because that hasn't happened in the past. Sometimes we've had sort of knee-jerk decisions that have been made without actually consulting the drivers, and all the drivers afterwards have gone, well, that's not going to work. If consult them for sure, but don't let them dictate proceedings, don't let them dictate what Formula 1 is going to become. That needs to be a decision that's made with polling everyone involved, and instead of everyone having an input, they should just be asked, and then a central body makes that decision, and that's what Ross's job is for me.